Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space. Today's episode is one that I've genuinely been looking forward to sharing with all of you, in part because it feels like a little bit of a blast from the past for me. You can probably tell that I haven't always been a professional political commentator. In fact, not too long ago, I was just another person who would occasionally dip into the world of politics by reading an article or a blog post here, catching a debate there, but never really diving in headfirst in a way that is my livelihood these days. And that is actually the perfect segue into today's guest, because he is someone who's been thinking, writing, and debating about politics for years, long before I made it a profession of mine. Now here's something even more interesting. Out of all the guests that I've had on this podcast, I've known about today's guest basically the longest. Like seriously, you could pick any name from any of the previous episodes of my podcast, and chances are I didn't know about them and I didn't read their work before I read from this guy's work, Habib Fanny. And the reason for that is simple: a website called Quora. Now, let's take a moment to talk about Quora, because for those who might not be familiar, Quora is a social media site built around questions and answers. Think of it as maybe like a slightly more thoughtful and nuanced version of Yahoo Answers. Back in the late 2010s, Quora was my own go-to place for engaging with big ideas, for reading takes that were a little nerdy, a little offbeat, and often surprisingly deep. It was a place where you could find people who genuinely wanted to explore the complexities of politics, history, philosophy, you name it. And Habib Fanny was one of the standout voices on that platform. When I first started reading Quora regularly, he was already a prominent writer, especially on political topics. His posts weren't just popular, they were often very thoughtful and well-argued. And even now, he still has over 100,000 followers on Quora, which is more than a lot of professional political pundits can claim about their Twitter following. And that is not just a number. It is a testament to the impact that he's had on shaping how people think about politics online. And I find it fascinating how a single self-contained site like Quora could be so formative for so many people's views, including that of my own. If you were a regular reader during that specific period in the late 2010s, you probably came away with a very different perspective on politics than someone who wasn't. But here's the thing, and this is where you're going to hear me editorialize for a little bit. Quora, the site itself, has changed a lot over the years. If you were last on the site 5 or 6 years ago even, you probably remember a very different atmosphere from what it is like today. And that is something that I wanted to dig into with Habib today. How did Quora change over time? Specifically, what happened to it in the past 5 or 6 years that motivated him to finally stop writing for it? And what happens when a platform that once encouraged open-minded debate starts to reward tribalism instead? I really enjoyed this conversation, not just because Habib is someone that I've read from for so long, but because he brings a level of good faith and intellectual honesty that I deeply respect. He tried to do his hardest with that back when he was a writer for Quora, and now he's doing it without fighting the algorithm as a writer for the Substack known as Politidoc. And throughout all of that, he is always looking for the nuance, the gray areas, and the places where the easy answers just don't cut it. All right, that's enough from me. Let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Habib Fanny. Hope you enjoy. Habib Fanny, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Pleasure. Glad to be here.
First question. What do you do for a living, and what are some of the ways in which it is completely unrelated to politics?
Oh, well, it's not related to politics at all. So I'm a rehabilitation physician. I work on the inpatient side, which means that I see people after they've had strokes and spinal cord injuries and accidents and the like. So most of my time is spent providing medical care to that patient population. And politics is just a hobby that I do on the side.
Well, I would say that's a pretty influential hobby, but I guess that requires you to describe a little bit of the backstory for why I got you on. Could you describe Quora for a minute? Because I'm sure some people know about it as a Q&A site. But I think to you, it was a little bit more. Could you talk about Quora and what it meant for you?
Okay, so I started using Quora in 2014 or so. Back then I was finishing med school and then starting residency. And I really needed something to escape to. It was a very stressful time in my life. And I found this platform. And the great thing about it was not just that you go there and get questions answered or answer questions of your own, but that it fostered a sense of community among nerds, for lack of a better term. And you could find people who are experts in virology or in medieval history or in politics or whatever else. And I thought, wow, this is a great place to be. I want to be here. It was a really nice community. I'd never used social media before. And that was, I found this space and I thought, wow, I have some things to say still. Maybe some people will want to listen. We'll see.
Quora was definitely a nerd site for all of us. But yeah, you wrote from like around 2014 to 2024. Is that correct?
That's correct. So for my 10 years, I was on there. I liked a lot of the voices, but I guess I was conceited enough to feel that I had something extra to add. Because of my background, because of my proclivities, I am not a huge fan of tribalism, and I really like for my opinions to be grounded in something more empirical. And let's just say that the vast majority of politics does not do that. And I felt that by trying to steelman the arguments of the other side, and by trying to do justice to the arguments of the other side, by trying to admit my own biases and to check them against the best data I could find, I could add something different. Over time, it turned out that people felt that they liked what I was writing, and I started getting a lot more followers than I'd ever anticipated.
I think even that description undersells yourself a little bit. Like I went back and checked, like you haven't been writing there for like a year and you still have more than 100,000 followers. Like how the hell did that happen? Like you have more followers on Quora than a lot of professional, actual like people who do politics for a living have on Twitter these days.
I can't believe that number either. Sometimes I look at it and I think, wait, there's literally more than 130,000 people who individually decided to follow me at some point. It's quite humbling and baffling because you can have this persona online, you can have this account, you can have all these followers, and of course your friends and family members, you're still just you to them. And I don't know anybody in my personal life who would listen to me for 10 minutes about politics, about any topic. But apparently there's a lot of people online who felt that I had something worth paying attention to.
I find it really interesting when you said you don't know anyone in your friends and family that would listen to you for 10 minutes about politics. Is it like you don't feel comfortable talking about politics with your friends or family, or they're not interested in hearing you?
Well, I think most of the arguments that I frame, right, they require paying attention to a lot of data and sometimes some graphs. First of all, and the vast majority of people just have no patience for that. And also, if you're my friend that I shitpost with or that I do whatever else with, the idea that you're going to sit there and be like, oh, let me just listen to this politics guru who's talking to me now, like in a way, people have to not know you to be able to take you that seriously. If they know every facet of you, it's very hard for them to be like, oh yeah, let me see what this guy has to say, But I find myself sometimes having discussions with people and I'm like, I have to approach it very humbly and say, hey, this is what I've considered. This is the data I've looked at. Please feel free to take it out if you feel so inclined,
Yeah, I'm sure that most people, like, if you were to walk up to some random person on the street, like, there's like more than a 99% chance that they don't know or care about Nate Silver, even if everyone considers him to be one of the most prominent, like, data analysts in the politics sphere.
Very true.
You consider like that the last like 5-year stint that you had in Quora when you were like incredibly high profile, you were one of the most read from political writers on just some casual Q&A site. Did you ever feel like a mini celebrity during that time?
Only very occasionally, because the number on Quora is a very self-contained space, right? So a lot of people are aware that Quora is a thing because you search something and then it's one of the links that pops up. You go, okay. Eventually you click on one of those links and sometimes you have an account that you're not really sure like how you got, etc. Right? So I'm aware of that, but unless somebody was a habitual user of the site, they're not likely to come across me. Now, I was one of the voices that most people, I would say, who were on the platform knew about, even if they didn't like me or agree with my content. But for people who were not on that platform, it was just not a thing in their lives. Every once in a while, I would meet someone at work or at the grocery store or something, and it would just be absolutely mind-boggling that they're like, "Oh my God, it's you!" I'm like, yes, it's me. I exist. Thank you.
What was it like during the times when people recognized you in public?
It's not like it happened a lot of time. I would say awkward more than anything else. So, even though I don't act like it most of the time, I'm still kind of shy. And so meeting somebody who's like, "Oh my God, it's you! Oh my God, like, can you take a picture?" And it's just very odd, because I'm not a famous writer. I'm not a famous journalist, and like it's just seeing somebody who in real life has that reaction to you. It's flattering, no question about it, but it's also more awkward than anything else.
Yeah. Do you ever was there ever any time when your writing was like seen or read by prominent professional political pundits?
I would not say so. No, I mean I came across some writers and things like that I interacted with, but nothing that would make me think that I was evolving in a different sphere. Which is also why interacting with people who knew me from the site or who wanted to check my socks or something, that was something I had for a while, where I was posting pictures of my socks when I wasn't being serious. That was why that was so odd, because I'm like, well, I'm definitely not in the same league as people who are known, who do this full time.
Yeah, but it is kind of fascinating. I feel like we could talk about your time in Quora all day, but I'll just spare you with just a few more questions. Do you feel comfortable talking about the time when Quora, the people but in charge of it, thought that you were violating their real name policy?
Oh yeah, that happened very early on, where I logged on and I couldn't use my account. I couldn't answer. I was edit blocked, as they called it, and at the time they were really, really uptight about their myriad policies. And one of the ones that had supposedly violated was the real name policy. They were very, very serious that you had to use your real name. There were some people who got away with not doing so, but I somehow did not get away with using my real name. And at first I was annoyed and I said, you know what, I'm not using this site anymore. But I was so addicted to using the site that I ended up coming back and I had to submit my ID. And I'm thinking, do you really think that I would fake a name that looks and reads like Fanny? Seriously, this is because my first name is Habib, right? And Habib means beloved. And so my name, in a way, my fake name, according to Quora, was Beloved Fanny or something like that. I looked at it, it's like, this is completely absurd. But it was their site and their rules, so I had to finally comply and, like I said, provide my ID and etc.
I do find it interesting. You were there for 10 years. Obviously, whenever a social media platform undergoes major changes, there's often a lot of backlash from its users saying, "Oh, they made this platform so much worse." Sometimes it's correct, sometimes incorrect. But what was your own perception of how Quora gradually changed in terms of tone, in terms of moderation, in terms of temperament? How did it change in those ways from the mid 2010s to the mid 2020s?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, obviously, there's a reason why I ended up leaving at some point, right? Which is that the platform it had become was not the platform that I had joined. In a way, I understand why they made the changes they did, because they wanted to democratize the place and make it more accessible to a lot of users, which from that standpoint has been a huge success. But if you joined because you were a nerd and you wanted a community of nerds and you wanted a mostly serious space where people were talking about serious things and there was less frivolity and there was more severity against insults and petty behavior and the kind of stuff that you would find in the comment section of YouTube, you would have been very disappointed by the end of it. I've heard many people use the word cesspool to describe what it became. Maybe that's too severe, but it definitely shows that a lot of us who started out, who were early users of the site, did not feel completely at home with the platform as it had become. And there was another element of it that I really did dislike too. I felt like at some point, all of the major serious questions had been asked. And a lot of the questions were like just people responding to, being baited. Hey, liberals, why are you all so retarded? And then somebody will come out and go swinging against all conservatives and also not look much better than the person who would ask the initial question in the first place. And eventually I thought, man, this platform is just not adding that much to my life at this point. It's just a lot of angry people venting and a lot less seriousness. And you had to dig a lot deeper to find the erudition, the reason why you joined in the first place.
Do you, so there's been a lot of studies, a lot of research at this point about the social media and like the negative effects that it has on people's mental health. Like one good example is that like the stuff that tends to get more traction on social media is the stuff that like dunks on people in order to exacerbate in-group, out-group differences. Did you feel that in your own way? Did you ever worry that spending more time on Quora was making you into a more tribal person?
It's definitely one of the things I had to fight against, right? Definitely. I wouldn't say that I myself necessarily became more tribal, but I could see how I was not impervious to being baited. And there were some things that I had written that I had to go back and delete because I looked at it after, my post-outburst clarity and decided, this is not how I want to portray myself. This is not what I want to be discussing online. But yes, you were rewarded for being partisan. You were rewarded for being tribal. That's what was most likely to get you a lot of traction. Occasionally, though, you could also get rewarded for looking like the good one. Oh, he's one of the good ones. So one of the absolute best ways to get traction on the site was to say, I've been a conservative all my life, but Donald Trump has come and destroyed conservatism forever, and I hate conservatives now. And look, now I'm a liberal. I found my way. Or I'm a black person, and I voted Democrat up until 2016, and then I saw the hypocrisy on the left, and then you would get so much love from the other side. So that was the other way to get traction too that I saw a lot.
Do you ever? I think one thing that I disliked about spending time on Quora during the later years that I was on it is that it almost felt like people were delivering arguments with much higher and much more unearned amounts of confidence, much more unearned amounts of certainty, because you knew that like if you caveated what you were saying with I think or I believe, or you were presenting it in a more nuanced way, that would be perceived as boring and that wouldn't get you as much upvotes as if you presented it as like totally true. Did you ever feel like writing for Quora's algorithm and trying to get upvotes, did you ever feel like that pressured you into presenting your own arguments with unnecessarily high amounts of moral certainty?
I hope not. I think I was lucky in that way, though, because for whatever reason, when people started paying attention to my writing, it was before that shift happened, and they liked my writing precisely because they were looking for a non-tribal, more empirically grounded voice. And so I never felt like I had to do that. And I try very much not to do it. I'm sure that you could find some examples of me, falling to the same trap because I'm human. But for the most part, I hope that people who are reading me would agree that I escaped that little trend.
Yeah, or maybe you continue to be much, much better than like the median Quora writer. It's just that as the general quality of the site degraded, being better than the median Quora writer would still be lower standard than you like a few years ago. That's also possible.
It's possible. What I did notice, though, eventually was that it was harder to find good questions to answer from the perspective that I wanted to bring. It was all about being angry, which is fine. There is a role for anger, right? We're all human. We all have emotions, and emotions are important. But after a while, it just gets tedious and boring to come to a site and all you see is, I'm a liberal angry about Trump. Oh, I'm a Republican angry about Democrats. And then you just read the same things over and over and over and over again. And it's like, you guys are saying using different words, but you're literally like rehashing the same pattern day after day after day. And don't get me wrong, there's sometimes when I write from a position of anger, but for the most part, I try to bring light to a topic. I try to, put together a couple of perspectives that maybe people didn't realize could be enmeshed and have a different way of looking at an issue. I really try to not fall into tribalism because it can really cloud people's judgment and lead people, including myself, to interpret data and developments through the prism of their ideology. And I really try not to be a prisoner of that.
Okay, I have two different ways to respond to that, so I'll try to give both responses. So the first thing is, you felt like it was getting harder and harder for you to find like good questions to answer because it felt like all of the good questions had already been asked. It's also entirely possible that there were still good questions to ask. It's just that over time, the more algorithmized Quora became, the more the algorithm promoted bad questions over good questions, because bad questions were the ones that provoked anger, and anger was the emotion that was most rewarded by the algorithm. So yeah, it's not like you ran out of good questions. It's more like Quora was deliberately not showing it to you because they knew that if they showed you questions that existed for you to take the bait, then that would be better because you would get more people upvoting you and reading you.
I think that's probably part of it. Yes, there is something to be said for anger being a really good way to foster engagement. Right? You have something, you come to the site, and the first question you see something that is insulting to your side, very hard not to take that bait.
Yeah. There was one thing that you mentioned earlier about how anger sometimes has a place. I agree, but I think the way that I would caveat it is that it is far more ethical to be angry at someone in a live conversation than it is to be angry at someone on social media. So let's imagine that I'm some teenager that I'm really focused on what the people in my school are saying on Instagram or TikTok. If I were to say something really angry to them in person, I might end up insulting them so much that they cry out of desperation or out of sadness, and then I recoil a little bit because I'm seeing the consequences of my actions firsthand. So it might have been right for me to be angry, and it might have been wrong for me to be angry, but in either case, I'm seeing the consequences of my actions firsthand. So if I did the right thing, I still have to come to terms with it was a net positive in spite of the consequences. Whereas if you were to say something really angry on social media, I think that a lot of the time the incentives are much worse, because if the person that you're angry at, if they get depressed, if they cry, if they get something really sad about them, or it has a really deleterious effect on their mental health, you don't see any of that. All you see is the fact that your angry post got 10 times as many upvotes as all of the posts where you were very measured and nuanced. So your anger essentially becomes a way to bask in all of the joy and the upvotes that you get. So what do you think of my pet theory?
I would say I agree with a lot of it. You definitely get rewarded for not being the best version of yourself online. Sometimes that reward is an upvote. Sometimes that's an emotional reward from somebody in the comments telling you, yeah, you got them good this time. All that is true. I do think even face to face, sometimes anger is not necessarily. There's a difference between feeling anger and responding in a nasty way, right? You have to ask yourself the question whether the way I'm responding is actually conducive to any positive outcome. And sometimes people are angry and lash out because they need some catharsis or something like that. But I don't know that I would necessarily frame it the same way you frame, but I do agree that there's a very strong incentive to be a keyboard warrior and to be the least measured version of yourself.
Yeah, and it's very easy to come up with superficially convincing arguments that being angry is keeping you on the right side of history.
Yeah. I mean, I see that a lot in terms of, you get inside your own head, you define the other person as something unacceptable, whether you call them fascist or communist or whatever it is. And then you say, well, look at what these people did in history. Therefore, it would be immoral for me to actually be nice to them, right? But you haven't proven that they're communists or fascists or that they intend to do anything. You've basically told yourself that this person is the equivalent of something that you've deemed unacceptable.
Yeah.
And therefore, it gives you license to be as nasty to them as you can get away with. And sometimes it's not those extreme examples, but it could be, the ideological framework that you bring to bear, whether it's social, from the social justice literature or from, whether it's feminism or whatever ideological framework you have. There's a way in which you can give yourself a pass for not treating people the way you should treat them, and feel that you're right to do so because they belong to such and such group that you identify as being perpetrators of atrocities or oppression, etc.
Yeah, So one thing that you said that I really enjoyed is that it's very easy to give yourself a pass about being angry at someone because they're on the wrong side of history and you're on the right side of history. I think that's another reason why it is both harder and less unethical to be angry at people in a live conversation, because there's a much clearer feedback mechanism about what their reaction is and how that should inform your behavior. Yeah, but so maybe that's enough discussion about anger for now. How would you say that your writing style has changed ever since you shifted to Substack?
This is a very good question. The biggest difference is that my output has decreased quite a bit. Part of the reason is that I feel like I'm writing for a more mature audience, including some people who are paid to subscribe to me. And when I was writing for free and it was just, and I don't charge most people, and I basically leave it up open to people in case they see it as a tip jar or something, like, hey, I'm going to subscribe to this guy and send him some money, right? But still, the fact that some people do makes me feel like I need to be producing higher quality stuff all the time. I can't just say, oh, by the way, this was my 10-second take on whatever happened in politics today,
or this is why this question is terrible and why you're wrong.
Yeah, right. There was a certain levity to my writing that has kind of gone away. Sometimes it was sometimes you wanted to just be snarky. Sometimes you want it to be funny. And I don't get nearly as much of an opportunity, or at least I don't give myself permission to do that. And I could still do it. It's been harder for me to let go of let me put my most serious hat on. I feel like I had a lot more voices when I was in Quora. And now I have there's some occasional snark and sarcasm that comes out, but it'd be like one line, in a 2,000-page essay. A 2,000, not page, word essay.
What do you miss most about your time as a Quora writer?
I definitely miss the large audience, right? I could write anything. I could post a picture of my breakfast. I could do whatever, and then it would be like, oh, here's 1,000 upvotes. Here's 5,000 people who like what you said, and here's 1,000,000 comments. So that is definitely something I miss. I miss the community. There was just a lot more people that I liked interacting with, even as the site turned into something that I disliked. There was still a lot of people that I really liked, and I don't get to see those people anymore unless I'm just scrolling on the site. And occasionally I still lurk and I read some things and upload and maybe leave a comment, but I might do that twice a month, whereas before it was a daily habit. So I definitely miss that.
If you'll allow me to editorialize about Quora one last time, I would say that one of the things there were a lot of things I disliked about Quora over time. Many of them we've already discussed, but I think one last reason is that there are tons and tons of people on the site that I love, but I almost felt like as the algorithm got worse, it felt like their writing got worse. It felt like they were becoming less open-minded and more tribal versions of themselves, without even realizing it as a way to serve the algorithm. Yeah, sometimes I'm afraid of going back to Quora because I feel like some of my favorite writers, if I read them right now, they probably just sound like a lot more tribal for reasons that aren't even conscious, but are just an unconscious way to suit the algorithm.
I think there's, I can think of examples of writers like that who I think are intelligent people, well-read, but the algorithm had that effect. And when I was reading their answers in later years, it was not the same rigor that I was finding it in earlier writing, unfortunately.
Yeah, but thankfully you're free from all of those incentives right now. Are there any tips that you've learned about how you can try to avoid succumbing to groupthink online?
I mean, being tethered to the principle of fairness is really important. Like, you have to be tethered to some core principles yourself in order to have some red lines, some places beyond which you will not go. For me, I have to steel man my argument, right? The easiest thing to do, whether it's in politics or any other kind of argument, is to find the weakest, least educated version of the argument the other side is making and to go dug on that. You feel so great about yourself. You're like, oh my God, look at these idiots. I have completely destroyed them, right? I mean, think of the word destroyed, how often it comes up in like videos online. Mehdi Hassan destroys, such and such group. Charlie Kirk destroys college student, right? It's just, it only happens when you go fight against either a straw man of your own making or a weak version of the argument on the other side. So for me, I try to understand the most complex, most educated version of the argument on the other side, and to make sure that I still disagree with it, and to understand for myself why I disagree with it in spite of understanding it in its best form. And it does a few things for me. I don't have this sense of self-congratulation. I mean, there's a lot of smart people on every other side of every issue, right? On the side that you disagree with. And it helps you refine your thinking to measure yourself against the best form of the argument on the other side. It helps you refine your own arguments. It helps you notice gaps in your own argument. And eventually, if you do this enough, engaging in just like partisan tribalism for tribalism's sake, it's just not rewarding anymore.
It feels boring compared to the dopamine spike that you would have otherwise received.
Definitely, yeah. It's like if you play chess. I play chess almost every day. Okay, it's like playing chess against somebody your own level versus a beginner. You're gonna win against a beginner every single time, but it should not bring you any pleasure. Like somebody just started playing chess, or there's like a 500-point gap between us. Why am I even playing? And what does it bring me to defeat them? Nothing.
Yeah, like you don't feel some like deep amount of joy if they blunder their queen on accident, because it's just like there was a 500-point gap. Of course they were going to do.
Yeah, I mean it's like arm wrestling against a toddler. Like, oh wow, look at me! I defeated this toddler again. I'm so strong. Oh, look at me.
So I guess with all of those lessons you've learned, both to become a better chess player and to become a more rigorous writer, what lessons have you learned about how you can write arguments with the right amount of like confidence or the most appropriate amount of epistemic certainty?
Okay, so for me, I start with what I believe, right? What do I believe? I believe that, let's say, we are veering towards authoritarianism, right? Let's say. And then I say, okay, what do I believe that? What are my best arguments to support it? Then I'll put them up. And then I'll say, okay, let me go find the best argument against each of these, right? And I'll try to find the smartest writers I can find and say, what have they said? Why am I an alarmist? Why am I wrong? And I hope I'm wrong, right? But let's not just go find them just so we can, again, dilute their arguments and take a simplistic version of it and dump on it. Let's go find them and assume for a second that they're right. Understand the argument on those terms. Okay, now that I understood the arguments on the other side, let me see if there's gaps in what I was bringing to bear, right? So there's that. And you do that enough rounds so that you feel like the argument is airtight. The second thing is just fact-checking. There are a lot of things that I think I know because human memory is very fascinating, but it's not a computer. It's not something that's going to be very faithful to how things actually happen. You're with a friend and you hear something and both of you will talk about it and you see that you have a slightly different version. You guys remember the words in a different order, or remember the sequence of events in a different order, right? So if you think you know something, are you even right? Is this even what the other person said? Is the data on your side? That very basic, it's just two things, right? But you did those two things, and you'll be ahead of the vast majority of writers, because most people don't bother doing that. If you believe something very strongly, you must feel that must be true in some sense, right? And when you do that, you get to some even uncomfortable scenarios, where one of the ways in which we judge racism in the US is whether the person claiming racism feels wrong. Okay, well, that's good. But can you feel that racism happened and be wrong? Of course you can. Right? And so the fact that I feel very passionate that something racist happened to me does not mean that it happened to me. Right? It could be that the person that I dealt with is a garden variety asshole who is an asshole to everybody. I just happen to be black, and that colors our interaction. It doesn't mean that they're racist, right? So I have to, before I arrive at a conclusion like that, I have to be really, really sure that I'm standing on solid ground. Otherwise, I say, I perceived this, and I leave it at that.
You need like a 95% confidence interval.
Yeah, something like that. Which is why I almost always feel comfortable. I'm more comfortable calling out certain things at the aggregate level instead of the individual level. I am not in somebody's head. I don't know if they're sexist or racist or whatever else, right? All I know is whatever's in front of me and how it makes me feel. And the way it makes me feel can be valid because I am right that they're racist. Or it could be invalid because I am being the racist because I'm judging them and assuming that they're racist because they're white or whatever else, right? And so I try to be very, very, very consistent, and I try to apply the same standards to others that I apply to myself. If I want to be indulgent to myself and give myself the benefit of the doubt on something, I'll do the same to somebody else.
What would you say, how would you say that your own politics have changed over the past 10 years or so? I know that you used to be a conservative, then you became a liberal, and it's not that explicit, but you refer to yourself as a leftist right now. How would you say that your own political path has changed over time?
I don't even know where I am right now. I know I'm on the left, right? But every term comes with a connotation that I feel like doesn't necessarily quite apply to me. I guess if I have to describe myself, I'll say that I am a left of center pragmatist. Yeah, so when I was conservative, it was mostly a social conservatism. That's basically what I grew up with. I grew up in a place that was very conservative, and I imbibed the mores and attitudes of that place, right? First time I heard about gay marriage, I thought it was the funniest thing I had ever heard of because, oh my God, these gays, they want to get married. Oh my God, how absurd. It was that kind of environment for me. So I went from that to having the Bush presidency be my political baptism, basically, when it comes to American politics. I learned to define myself against George W. Bush. Like many millennials, I'm 39 years old. So in 2001, I was 15, and that's what I was watching. I was watching conservative governance in action, and I pretty much didn't like any of it. At the time, I was still Muslim. I had just come from a Muslim country. I didn't like the war on terror. I thought it was really idiotic to lump Iraq with Saudi Arabia or Iraq with Afghanistan, and none of it makes sense to me. The idea that you could just take people from similar-ish, maybe if you squint, regions of the world and yeah, they're the same. These guys attacked us, so therefore let's go attack this other group of people. I didn't like the war on stem cell research. I didn't, when I first started out, again, I thought gay marriage was ridiculous. But watching conservatives in action talk about gay marriage, I didn't want to be that hateful. And it made me pro-gay marriage in the end, right? It was I learned to define myself again.
Oh, they negatively polarized you.
Yeah. I'm I never would have said I support gay marriage. Whenever I saw a friend who was like, hey, I'm an ally, and they would support a flag, I would think, well, that's weird. But if I heard conservatives talk negatively about people who are not straight, it was such a turnoff that it eventually made me go the other way because I didn't want to be that on that side, right? Also, I was an immigrant, and the side that was willing to welcome immigrants was the side that I had the most disagreement with on social policy. But over time, I became assimilated into that side, the tribe, whatever you want to define it, right? And then the Obama years happened. And again, I see a lot of ugliness on the other side. Not that Democrats were perfect, but it was a lot of the reaction to Obama was just so disproportionate to what he was actually proposing. And so I come out of that fairly, like a pretty standard liberal. At this point, I'm still fairly young, at least in my own head. And I am definitely left of center. I'm liberal. I'm liberal enough to feel like Hillary Clinton is too conservative. I'm liberal enough to be a supporter of Bernie Sanders, but not liberal enough to not see the gaps in his argument. And I think that's when the first divergence between myself and what I would perceive as the left today started. I looked at Bernie Sanders and I thought, okay, I like where he wants to take the country, but whenever I take a look at his plans, he doesn't necessarily answer how to raise the money to pay for any of this. And I just have no patience for that. If you are trying to tell me that you want a universal healthcare system, I'm all with you. But you have to have an honest conversation about trade-offs. Every policy has trade-offs. And if you pretend that they're not, or that you can just wave a magic wand and make them go away, I'm going to have an issue with you. So that was the first point of departure.
I think sometimes I feel like we completely overlook just how much more progressive, how much more left-wing the Democratic Party became from 2008 to 2020 or so. Yeah. You mentioned a lot about how you were, maybe like for lack of a better word, you were kind of miffed by the way that Republicans treated Obama, which was kind of disproportionate relative to how he acted. I think that the Republican response to Obama, that plus the rise of Trump in 2016, essentially negatively polarized Democrats in general into becoming far more progressive than even Obama was during his first term. I think
100%.
Yeah, it's kind of it's kind of fascinating just how much negative just how much we define ourselves in opposition to the people that we dislike.
And sometimes that is unfortunately very counterproductive. So I'll give you two examples. One of them was immigration, right? Immigration. Now I'm an immigrant. Do I care about open borders? No, I don't. I think this country had open borders for most of its history, and the country is still here. Nothing's going to happen. I realize that is not a way to win elections in 2025 or 2024, apparently. And so if you're going to be running, I would advise you to be a bit closer to the median position on immigration, which is apparently more restrictionist than where Biden was, right? Now, I don't think Biden was an open borders president. I think he had a really, really complicated border crisis. And I think people underestimate the extent to which he tightened things very much, in many cases more severely than Trump. But that was never the perception. And Democrats became the party of people who could not rhetorically even signal that they wanted a tougher, more restrictionist immigration response, which, again, as an immigrant, I thank them. As somebody who is on the left and would like them to win elections, I think maybe that was not the right call. But so the immigration, the Democratic Party became much more liberal. When I was coming up, there was such a thing as an anti-war left. There was a left that talked very much about wanting to spend less on the military so that we could spend more at home on a universal healthcare system, say. Today, that talk is pretty much gone because Trump got too cozy with Russia. And so Democrats who had not been worried about Russia at all under Obama became really, really hawkish against Russia and wanting to deepen our alliance system in Europe, which is the opposite of what you want to do if you want to save money and spend more on a generous social safety net.
Yeah, it's all of these dynamics are so fascinating. Like take immigration, for example. I think there are two trade-offs that people often have a hard time reconciling. So one trade-off is that there's a push and pull in terms of how much you can rhetorically signal your support for immigration and how much you can actually get done for policy, like for immigration on a policy level. Like I would not be surprised if sounding more socially conservative on immigration is what would allow congressmen to like behind closed doors, like secretly make deals that would actually like support much higher rates of immigration in the first place, even if it's not aesthetically pleasing or emotionally cathartic to the voters that would want to vote for them. And then the second thing that I think is there's also a trade-off between high-skilled and low-skilled immigration, like immigrants. Like, if you want to get people who are like very college educated or want to get H1B visas, then that's one thing. But that's also like a separate thing from if you want to get more like low skilled immigrants or like working class immigrants. And though like there's a trade off between that and also like the way that those two things get perceived by the electorate is also very different.
100%. Although it should be added that just because you have a quote-unquote reasonable position on immigration and you talk tough about immigration doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be rewarded for it. So Obama was known as a deporter-in-chief during his years. And the reason he was so tough on deportation was because he was trying to get a deal with the Republicans. But of course, a deal is the last thing they wanted. They were more interested in keeping immigration alive as something they could campaign against than in solving the issue. Although I should mention as well that the Democrats had their own intransigence at the time. They were really fixated on a path to citizenship. Now, a path to citizenship is fine, but it's not necessary. You could just have a path to legality, right? If someone came illegally, they're eligible to become legal. Their kids, if they're born in the US, can become citizens. But they themselves, that door is forever closed. I think the vast majority of people who are undocumented would have taken that deal in a heartbeat. But the Democratic Party of 10, 20, 15 years ago didn't want to go there, perhaps because they'd imagined that large numbers of new Hispanic voters would translate into natural permanent majorities. I think both parties were very wrong on that score, but maybe that's a story for a different question.
Were you one of those people who bought like in the mid to late 2010s? There really was this whole demographics is destiny thesis about how like the U.S. is becoming much more racially diverse, and like the Democratic Party is going to be allowed to become a lot more liberal or a lot more progressive because like all of these Latinos and Asians and like all these different kind of minority Americans were going to support the Democratic Party and make things a lot more progressive. Did you buy into that thesis during its heyday?
I think we all did. Not just myself, and I definitely did, but Democratic strategists did, and so did Republican strategists, because it informed how they responded to immigration, right? If they had known that Latinos would be a swing electorate, whose votes would be obtainable by someone as right-wing on immigration as Donald Trump, I think it would have scared them a lot less. But yeah, we all had bought into that theory that, it was the 21st century was a Democrats to lose, and that it was almost inevitable that with a more cosmopolitan electorate, a less white electorate, a more educated electorate, et cetera, Democrats were going to win bigger and bigger elections. And in a way, it did happen because Democrats became the party of the more educated, more cosmopolitan people. What they did not foresee was that the other side, the erosion of support for the Democratic Party among working class constituencies of all races.
I do think that's kind of interesting. It also reminds me of an article that I sent you before we did this recording about the nature of populism. If I were to try to give my best summary of the piece, it would be that like some aspects of populism are sort of ingrained as like a default nature of the human brain. Like there are different ways of thinking. One way of thinking is very slow and like abstract and controlled, and another way of thinking is very fast and like unconscious. It's just like your automatic reflexes as a response to something. So the author, Joseph Heath, his thesis is that a lot of the time, the ways in which populism gets power throughout the world is basically that populists and authoritarians are able to exploit the gap between people who think in very slow and methodical ways and people who think in very fast and like reflexive ways. So those are where the disagreements arise. I'm going to quote the article. The fact that immigration does not create unemployment because it increases both the supply and the demand for labor is highly unintuitive, and yet leads elites to take a much more casual view about the labor market effects of migration than the public does. Elites then make things worse by moralizing this disagreement, suggesting that the public position, like opposition to immigration, must be motivated by racism. Thus, those elites present themselves not only as smarter, but as morally superior to the rest of society, end quote. So what do you think of this author's thesis that like opposition to immigration is sort of baked in as like a default human position that it takes education to like rewire people out of?
I have a lot of sympathy for the argument, although I would warn against how it is phrased. There is a certain amount of self-congratulation baked into this. If you're an educated person reading this, it's almost like you're part of the elite of the, of the cognitive elite. You're thinking better than the other people. You're not as given to far-sighted thinking as the rest, right? I don't necessarily think that's true. I think what education does is give people the tools to be really good at sounding dispassionate. But at the end of the day, we are all very much driven to reinforcing what we want to already believe. And again, a lot of what I do in terms of writing is trying to fight this tendency. And so I know that even in myself, it's still very much alive. So it's true that a lot of populism sounds like, hey, I hate immigrants. Let's bring all these people here. They're changing their culture. They're going to take my job, right? It's true that a lot of populism looks like simple solutions to complex issues. But we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which educated people also like simple solutions. But they're just very good at camouflaging those simple solutions with like a lot of things that looks like there's a lot of extra work. It's more like, hey, look at me. I'm so smart. Yeah, I like immigrants. Cool. So let me go find a 20-page paper about why immigrants are so great, right? So anyway, with that aside, I do think that yes, there's definitely a gap between popular preferences and the preferences of the cultural elite. Part of that stems from education. Part of that stems from interest. So if you are an educated person, mass migration of low-skilled people does not threaten you in any way, right? Like, so you can bring 20 more million people who are low-skilled workers to the US. I would barely notice. If anything, it's going to make hiring a carpenter, hiring construction workers cheaper. I'm going to be delighted. If you are someone who has to compete day-to-day with those laborers, economists can explain to you until they're blue in the face that, hey, at the aggregate level, this doesn't actually hurt people, but it can't necessarily tell you that it won't hurt you in, where you happen to live, right? Your own specific localized market here. Maybe you and your friends were the, we're worth, I don't even know, 20% of the construction worker market. Now there's like 20 more of you. I can understand, even though I can't sympathize because I'm not those people, and it's not my life. I can understand where their concerns come from. And we on the left have not found a way to adequately address those concerns. Usually we would tell them, hey, the world is changing, just here's some retraining, go, here's some redistribution,
Oh, learn to code, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, learn to code, right? Go back to school, become a nurse. Here is some more, tax credits. But the thing is, people don't want tax credits. They want their job. There's a certain dignity that people feel from doing a job every day. Again, I can't relate to it. I would love to be independently wealthy and retired, but the vast majority of people want to be able to do something every day. And if you're just giving them what looks like a handout, it doesn't seem like a solution to them. Now, I don't think the people on the other side have a solution. I don't think immigration restriction is going to bring back all the jobs that have gone away since the 70s. But because they're willing to at least engage with us on the argument, they get a lot more of a hearing. They get a lot more, they're more trusted to deal with those issues that people are on the left.
That does make me fascinated because, not only do Americans support immigration at much lower rates than people expected, but even immigrants themselves support immigration rates much less than people expected. One of the things that I think was most notable about the 2024 election is how immigrants, one of the people that the Democratic Party was trying to cater to the greatest extent, turned significantly rightward. So it does make some kind of impression on me that not only do a lot of working class people oppose immigration, but people who recently migrated to the country also oppose immigration.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And how immigrants are from working class backgrounds, right? And look very much like the working class people domestically, except that they may be from Cameroon or Nicaragua or something, right? And they tend to have a lot of conservative attitudes on immigration, on transgender rights, on gay marriage. One of the issues that are a lot closer to the Republican position than the Democratic position is, and that is one of the things that I think a lot of strategists on the left were not foreseeing. And even myself, I thought that perceptions of Republican racism would shield Democrats against that dynamic. And I wrote a long time ago that if we ever got to the point where Republicans were not perceived as racist, that they would be in trouble, because a lot of the new voters and newcomers are social conservatives, in essence. I just didn't think that we were there yet. But I think what must have happened in 2024 is concerns about cost of living issues and inflation must have been so high that they were high enough to make a lot of those voters walk away from the Democratic coalition.
I think that argument is like the majority of the explanation. I have one explanation that is not as salient, but I think is still like one's like significant, albeit smaller explanation in addition to what you said. I think that take, for example, Latino immigrants. I think you're probably not surprised if I were to say that I think people who immigrate to the U.S. tend to be very patriotic, which is part of the reason why they chose to go to the U.S. in general. I think part of the reason why Latino Americans turned against the Democratic Party is because they perceive the Democratic Party as not being very patriotic. They perceive the Democratic Party as being less patriotic or even sometimes anti-American compared to the Republican Party. And that perception of not being patriotic trumped any perception of what they would consider like harms from like racial slurs or whatever. That's another theory that I have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of truth to that. I think a lot of being on the left these days is training yourself to be against things that are really widespread around the world and that are, I would call them natural, right?
Maybe that's one thing that you have in common with the author of the article that you just criticized.
No, I understand. I'm not. I criticize the phrasing, and I want God against something. But I agree with, I would say, 90% of the argument. But there's just, you go around the world, a lot of people have a marked in-group preference, right? If they're Christian, they prefer other Christians. If they're darker skin, they prefer other darker skin people. If they're lighter skin, if they're Asian, if they're right, those things are very widespread. A lot of what left-wing ideology is asking everyone to do is to be less nationalistic, less, religious, or less, at least, partial to people of your own religion, less patriotic, less all of those things. And that's a hard sell for the vast majority of people, right? Most people want to feel that we are the good guys, we are doing the right thing, we are right, we are the greatest, etc. The average immigrant who comes to the U.S. is very grateful to have made it to the U.S. The average college-educated left-of-center person is less likely to express gratitude about having been born in the U.S. and is more likely to assume that if they'd been born in a different country, their circumstances would be better. And I think part of that comes from a tradition of self-criticism, which in the beginning is very, very healthy. But over time, it can devolve into a sort of self-hatred that makes you feel like other places have got it figured out. But the reality is, most of those places, they're struggling too. They have their own issues. They may have a universal healthcare system, but that system is under strain. They may have a universal healthcare system, but the people's purchasing power is a lot lower. Everything in politics and in policy making is about trade-offs. And I think sometimes on the left, there's not enough of a recognition of the things that the U.S. does do very well.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of this one piece that Ezra Klein wrote in the New York Times a few years ago. He was talking about Ukraine, but one thing that he mentioned at the end is how there's one aspect of Christianity that he admires about how it's a belief in like solidarity and community, not out of how great we are, but how broken we are. So like he phrases it in terms of like I've always admired that merger of self-criticism and deep solidarity. The way I would describe maybe one of the shortcomings of the left today is that it's filled with like deep like self-criticism, but like A, it doesn't have that much solidarity, and B, when there is solidarity, the solidarity is focused like on very specific identity groups rather than everyone as a whole. Like the solidarity is focusing on the ways in which you are different from other people rather than the ways in which you are similar to people. And I think that describing it that way, it does sound a lot more intuitive, why a lot of immigrants who like often risk their own lives to move to the US feel turned off by the identity politics of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are worth touching upon. So I'm an immigrant, right? I am very grateful for being in the US. If you ask me, I will tell you that coming to the US is the single best thing that has ever happened to me, right? Very difficult to get similar sentiment on the left. And I don't blame people. The US has done a lot of things that are not great, okay? And continues to do a lot of things that are not great. But it is also undeniable that if you are a human being born here, you are one of the lucky ones, right? You already won a life lottery just by virtue of being born within these borders. Now, not every single person is going to do well, but your chances of doing well economically are so much better than elsewhere. That's number one. The second thing you touched upon was the what I would say the lack of universal values, or the loss of universal values, almost the rejection of universal values of the left. And it comes from a good place in the beginning. The beginning is, if you give everybody exactly the same thing, some people are going to be left behind because some people need more help than others. Okay. If you have a population of people who were enslaved and discriminated against, and you just say, you're equal now, good luck. Chances are, you come back 2 generations later, they're still going to be struggling. Okay, let's recognize that and have some remedies to compensate for that, to take that into account. But you get to a point where you get a rejection of universal values, where the standards that you apply to one group of people are different from the standard you apply to a different group of people, right? So if a black person says something racist against white people, you give them a pass, but the vice, if it's the reverse, you don't. If a woman says something that sexist against a man, you give her a pass. If a man says the same, he loses his job, right? That kind of stuff becomes less and less acceptable over time, the more removed you get from the worst version of the abuse, right? So there was a time that it was Jim Crow. Okay, well, you want to be kinder to black people 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, 50 years later, 70 years later? It's going to be a harder and harder sell. And one of the unfortunate things that I find these days, and one of the ways I have a harder time relating to the left, is I am still very much attached to universal values. I think that if racism is bad, it is bad for everybody. If sexism is bad, it is bad for everybody. If we need to help women when they're left behind, then if circumstances change and men are now struggling more in school, we need to be helping men. And we need to have a message to men that is actually real and rooted in their lived experiences. That's not just, let me go on more podcasts and talk to, podcast bros. That's not going to do it. There's a reason why those young men, not just in the US, but in the UK, in France, in Germany, are gravitating towards the right. There's a reason. There's something that they're getting. There's a side that is actually paying attention and acknowledging that they have problems. Whereas one side, all it has to offer them is, hey, you can be an ally to women. Hey, you can be an ally to gay people, which is fine. And because that allyship is needed. But if you're not even acknowledging that the groups that you've identified as privileged are not privileged in every way and can and do struggle, they're not going to pay attention to you.
Yeah. I was expecting to disagree with you quite a bit before we started recording. And now I'm worrying if we agree too much, and there needs to be some kind of tension in order for
maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah. All right, fine. Could you give the audience your views on the Insurrection Act and also what it is?
Okay. The Insurrection Act, after the basically, this is what Trump threatened. It is using in order to justify sending troops to mostly, Democratic-led cities, right? The idea is that he's trying to use ICE to apprehend illegal immigrants, and that they are interfering with the normal workings of the federal government. Okay, and that the Insurrection Act gives him the right to do that. And I decided a few weeks ago that I was going to write about it because I was, enraged because, my that's my proclivity is to be, sympathetic to the rule of law and to thinking that, hey, you should just be able to just send troops to any city with vague pretenses. You have a high chance of inflaming the situation. You have a high chance of causing the very insurrection that you're claiming to be fighting against. So I get on my high horse and I start writing and I look into things and I read the Insurrection Act. And I don't know if you can pull it up in full.
I can pull it up in full. I can pull up the excerpts that you quote in your own article. I can just quote your own quote if you want.
Please do, because I don't have that memorized. But it was really shocking to me, and I realized, oh my God, he can totally do this. There is no, even if you don't like him, you read the Insurrection Act, and you see that, oh wow, it does give the president the right to do this. Now, most presidents who've been elected to office would not use it this way, but he is on sound legal ground if he decides that what is happening gives him the right to do that. But anyway, go ahead and read it.
The president, by using the militia or the armed forces or both, or by any other means, shall take such measures as he considers necessary to suppress in a state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy if it, 1, so hinders the execution of laws of that state and of the United States within the state, that any part or class of its people is deprived of a right, privilege, immunity, or protection named in the Constitution and secured by law, and the constituted authorities of that state are unable, fail, or refuse to protect that right, privilege, or immunity, or to give that protection, or 2, opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States, or impedes the course of justice under those laws. In any situation covered by Clause 1, the state shall be considered to have denied the equal protection of the law secured by the Constitution, end quote.
So right now, what's happening doesn't meet the criteria for Clause 1, but Clause 2 is so broad, right? Right now we have immigration laws on the book. And if the government wants to enforce those laws, and you have a group of people who are combining to say, hey, we're going to stand in the way of ICE agents or whatever, this language is broad enough to give him the right to deploy troops. I think it's a silly way to use troops. I think it's more likely to cause harm and disruptions than not. But it's very hard for me to argue that this is not legal. More to the point, the Supreme Court has 6 conservatives, as we know, and conservatives who have bent over backwards to give the president broad authority to do, things that are sometimes questionable. In this case, they studied on much firmer ground than on some of the other cases where they've told him he could do whatever he wanted pending, the end of litigation. And so, yeah, sometimes you start with the premise, you think, we must have laws that make such and such thing illegal. And you realize, oh, those laws were drafted 150 years ago in a different world, and they haven't been changed. And because nobody has bothered using the law in such a way, nobody's had even to think about going back and amending the law. And so here we are.
That does make me, I think it's kind of interesting. So obviously, I do not support President Trump using the Insurrection Act to bring troops into liberal cities. I think it's horribly unethical, horribly immoral, very authoritarian, yada, yada, yada. But I do want to push you about whether or not it suggests that the law itself was bad. Can you think of any potentially good use cases of the Insurrection Act?
Yeah, Clause 1. Right? You have a group of people, let's say a minority, who is being persecuted, and the state is not using its power to protect that, right? It has been used to protect Black people in the South. It's a fantastic, Clause 1 is fine.
Oh, Dwight, Eisenhower, Little Rock, that, yeah.
It's great. I mean, I wouldn't change that part. The part that I would change is the part that makes it so broad, where the president is the only person who gets to determine whether the laws of the United States are being impeded. And he's the one who gets to deploy those troops. Because any president can do this in theory, right? In theory, if you are a Democratic president, you can say, hey, there's a group of people in Idaho that I don't like, who are white nationalists, and they've gathered in such and such place, and they're doing this, and they're preventing blah 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 from happening. Let me just go send troops. The problem with sending troops is quite often, again, you instead of dispersing people and instead of de-escalating, you're going to be escalating. Now, if you are an authoritarian or would be authoritarian, escalating is something you love to do, because when you escalate, it gives you a chance and an excuse to say, see, I told you these people were violent. I told you I needed more power to suppress them. So thankfully, most people in those states, especially in Portland, I don't know if you see the reaction, I just love the fact that they're like just trolling these people and dancing and having live music, and it's just been a festive atmosphere. And so it hasn't really given him as much of a chance to, enact the authoritarian playbook as he would have liked. But yeah, I would change part of the law, just because when I say a law is bad, I don't mean that the entire law is bad. I just mean that it is poorly drafted and it is too broad, and it just needs to be narrowed. It needs to be specified when the president can do this, and all these broad exceptions need to be really, really tailored. It also needs to be some other check on that power, right? Like maybe a declaration from Congress or a declaration from a federal judge, just something, anything other than just whenever the president feels like it, he can just deploy the military to wherever he was.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with like making minor amendments to it. I think one thing I will say is that there's a limit to how much laws can help you. Like, so the concept of a social contract, where America's democracy is founded on a social contract, where like the people, like American politicians, American governors, the people who govern America, they have they have a duty to help serve and protect the American people. But the American people themselves also have to uphold the social contract by like electing people that are actually like responsible and are not like unhinged lunatics. So I would say that like even if like some of this could be like helped a little bit by amending the Insurrection Act, the main fault of responsibility lies not with like a law that where if you squint sideways and sprinkle lemon juice on it, then like it provides some leeway that authoritarians can exploit. I think the main fault lies with voters for voting in the authoritarian, rather than like always looking through every single law to make sure that every single one of them is authoritarian proof. What would you say to that?
I think you can walk and chew gall at the same time, and I think you can have partial responsibility and more than one person can have responsibility. So one thing is that is clear is when people vote for authoritarians, I would say the vast majority of people who do so, or the vast majority of the country, does not realize that they're voting for an authoritarian, right? They may think, this is overblown. Oh, I just want lower prices. People can vote for lower prices or think they're voting for lower prices, not necessarily for authoritarianism, right? They may think, I think there's too much insanity on the left. I need somebody who is, going to crack down on that stuff. And then next thing you know, they voted for somebody who wants to be a dictator. So there's that part of it, right? Two, laws have to be drafted with the worst case scenario in mind. You're never going to be able to prevent everything, but it shouldn't be so easy to deploy. At the very least, it should not be so easy, right? There's a reason why we have constitutional rights, because we know that people are not geniuses, people are not infallible, and sometimes they will vote for somebody who is an authoritarian. Sometimes they will do so because the person is a great actor and can pretend not to be. Sometimes the person starts out as not an authoritarian and becomes one later on. So like you have Viktor Orban in Hungary, who the first time he was in government, governed normally. And then the second time he came back, slowly started shifting power in a way that it became nearly impossible for the opposition to win and controlling the media and then changing what people even hear. And then before you know it, you have a system that is, as far as I'm concerned, not compatible with EU values. But, that's not my fight.
Yeah, but I guess maybe the one last thing I'll say about this is that, like, obviously you can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, but it is worth noting that, like, compared to other countries, like including other first world countries, the U.S. is unique in terms of the way that it prizes freedom and individual liberty. Like, like an example would be that, like, not including all the controversies this year, the U.S. has traditionally had much, much better free speech laws than basically the rest of the world. And I think that example of like prizing individual liberty is, in a way, sort of reflected in the laws about like the leeway that it gives to the people that govern the country. And I think that, like, in ideal US, obviously you can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. But I think that a lot of the time, the vision of the US that people have is like people that are not always unfettered in terms of like laws, or like okay, that was a bad way of phrasing it. People that are not always unfettered by bureaucracy and not always like try to dot every single T and every single I in terms of making sure that every single law is like something that cannot be exploited in a worst case scenario, because that prevents things from being good in a normal scenario. And I think there is some kind of trade-off in terms of how much leeway you can give to people who govern the country and how much faith you need to have in terms of voters that they will like vote for people that are sane. That's what I will say.
Yeah, there's definitely a natural tension between restricting what government can do, right, and enabling that government to be nimble enough to accomplish things. And again, it's impossible to get a perfect balance, and it's going to depend on whom you get in power. I can't disagree with that. I would say that current events demonstrate conclusively that the current balance is off. It needs to be tightened up. And maybe it doesn't mean that we revamp all of our laws, but at least there's been a default assumption that there are places that a president would not go. That assumption has been proven to be wrong. And because we know that now, it behooves us to change the system in such a way that even if we get a Donald Trump 2.0, 3.0, 5.0, that person is unable to enact the authoritarian playbook.
This is the sort of situation where I wish that I disagreed with you more, because then I feel like this would have been a more interesting conversation. I guess, yeah, so maybe the last thing I'll say is that I'm mostly on board with you. I guess like the one tiny quibble is that like we should amend the laws, but I think we should keep an even greater focus on like changing the hearts and minds of voters, because I think that that's like that has a greater causal effect on what's happening right now than like the wording of like individual laws.
That is very true, but I would say that you are, if that's the case, then you are much more of an optimist than I am. I don't know how to change people's minds. I really don't know. I think sometimes people get into a position, and it has a lot more to do with a religious or ideological belief than it does with rationality. And it would be like saying, I think we should convince fewer people to be, more people to leave Christianity or something like that. Like, I don't know how you do that, right? I mean, you can aspire to do it, but to make people value those things, I tend to be very pessimistic when it comes to those things.
Have you ever been able to successfully change someone's mind?
Yes, but on very rare occasions. And when those things happen, I did not take credit for changing their mind. I decided that something must have been happening in their own lives, that they were ripe for change, and I was nothing more than a catalyst. So I didn't create the reaction. I sped it up for people who were chemistry nerds.
Or you were the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah, something like that, right? So like I've had interaction with somebody who described himself as a racist, and that I changed his mind, or that I was pushing him to not be, or something like that, right? Again, hard conversation to have, but I think sometimes necessary conversation to have. Am I a miracle worker? No. Can you send me out there and go talk to other racists? No. This guy clearly had some qualms about his racism and was seeking out a safe space to discuss those. And apparently I'm a safe space for racists. Probably such an announcement. If you're a racist, please call me. And I was able to have some productive conversation with him over the course of months. And he finished in a place that was, more in line with, I guess, modern left-wing discourse. I think he ended up somewhere to my left, much to my chagrin, but that's okay.
Maybe he essentially flipped in, like he was just as tribal as he used to be, just in the opposite direction.
That tends to happen sometimes, right? Like sometimes the zealotry stays, but the religious ideology or changes.
All right, so one final question. Mm-hmm. Let's imagine that you met the version of yourself from like the version of yourself from, I don't know, like 20 years ago that was a lot more conservative, that had like completely different political opinions. Let's say that you met someone else that was just like what you were 20 years ago, and that you heard him saying all the views that you had back then. How do you talk to that person?
Dear God. Again, I am such a pessimist about human nature, right? There's a part of me that wants to say, well, if that kid could become me, everybody who was like that could become me. And for the most part, it's not true. I feel like I became me for reasons that are so specific to my own life and unlikely to be replicated. So usually, to be honest, when I meet someone who has that big of an ideological divergence with me, I focus on points of agreement. And I just steer the conversation away from disagreement, unless we're specifically there to discuss views and divergences. I have not found that I have any more of a capacity for proselytism and conversion than any other religious or political preacher out there. I would say that I'm good at listening and hearing the best version of the argument, right? Like, so instead of using poorly framed argument as an opportunity to dunk on people, doing something that's a bit more generous, but also a bit more emotionally difficult, which is rounding up their argument to the next more logical, more educated framing of it, right? So I can do that. I can hear them well. I can point out places where we agree. I can point out potential downsides of taking their argument to their logical conclusion. But that, in most respects, doesn't change people's mind. I'll give you an example. I'm African. Hello, in case you didn't know. And a lot of Africans, like I mentioned, are very socially conservative, right? So as an educated liberal, it's very clear to me that the U.S. still allows slavery. Slavery, when you are incarcerated, is still slavery in my book, and I still think it's reprehensible, right? But when the law was drafted to, the Constitutional Amendment, the 13th Amendment was drafted, it very much left room for ongoing unfree labor, uncompensated labor, as long as you have been duly convicted of a crime. Well, what is unfree, uncompensated labor? I left my own terminology, but not slavery. I discussed this with a friend of mine who is also an African immigrant, but different level of education, different sensibility. And I was trying to say, we should at least pay these people minimum wage. And he was very much not in favor of that whatsoever. It was not really, it really didn't bother him that much that this was slavery. It was like, well, they're being punished. He was completely fine with them being punished by being made to work. Whereas I was, shall I say, not pleased by that idea, right? Can I convince a man like him? I don't think so. I think I could hear him, and he could hear me, and we can disagree and smile and talk about what we're going to have for dinner. But I don't think I'll change his mind.
Habib Fanny, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast. It was a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And great show. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.